Go ahead and get started. So I'll give a little introduction here. So this is like our second session here, kind of under the natural order. Um, Today the topic's going to be kind of centered around the Federal Reserve and just a little bit of history, basically all the ways that they are screwing us over and some of the other connections to that. Paul here is with me, and he is going to kind of lead that discussion. And yeah, we'll go from there. I'll go and let you take it away, Paul.
Yeah, and I published an article on this on Ungs.com a few years ago. Got quite a bit of notice there. So basically the thing we're going to start looking at first is a graph of worker pay versus productivity. And it basically shows, if you look at it from about mid-1940s up until the early 1970s, worker pay consistently grew, like basically every single year. Consistent worker pay growth, and we saw worker pay almost double in the space of about 25 years. So as of like 1971, I think we were up to just over 90% growth in both worker pay and worker productivity. So those two lines basically overlap perfectly. As productivity went up, workers got paid more. Basically what you would expect, although some economists these days will try to tell you that that's not something that you should expect, because since the early 1970s, worker pay growth has been basically stagnant. We've seen, so as you can see on the graph there, from 1971 to 1972, productivity continued to go up, pay was stagnant. In 1973 through 1975, both pay and productivity fell, and then productivity started going back up again. Pay was still lagging behind basically for the rest of the 70s, and then in the 80s, worker pay actually fell quite a bit up until about the mid-90s or so when the dot-com tech bubble boom started. And then worker pay went up for a few years. It stagnated again in the early 2000s. Then in 2008, it had the single biggest jump that it has had since basically the start of the 1970s, the single biggest year of growth since the 1970s, from 2008 to 2009, and then it stagnated again. So when you look at the graph, you see that in the space of about 25 years at the start of the graph, worker pay almost doubled in basically one generation. And then in the roughly 50 years since then, worker pay has barely gone up, but productivity has almost doubled again. Like, it's way up. And so this is kind of a big issue for people, because if you do the math, you find that you're losing about a third of what you ought to be paid. So take your current paycheck. If you're making $1,000 a week, multiply by 1.5, you should be making $1,500 a week instead of $1,000 a week. So that's something where pretty much everyone can look at how they're doing financially and see that you're not making anywhere near as much money as you should be making, and there's got to be a reason for that, especially when you look at the fact that there was a period of time there where workers were getting a significant raise every single year, and unfortunately that didn't last. So today we're going to look into that and find out why worker pay stopped going up in the early 1970s, and why those two lines separated and disconnected in the early 1970s.
Very good. Yeah, and I was going to say too, I don't want to get ahead of myself or ourselves and or derail us or anything. But when I see a graph like this, one of the first things that comes to my mind is getting off the gold. What happened in the 70s? Like we decoupled the dollar from gold. The gold standard. So I'm sure that's a piece of the puzzle, but I know there's probably a lot more.
Right. So there was this policy called Bretton Woods that was in place from I think it started just before the end of World War II. And lasted until 1971. And it wasn't exactly a strict gold standard, but what it did was it basically tied the dollar's value to the selling price of gold. So what that ended up doing was it didn't necessarily limit the Federal Reserve's ability to create new money, but it limited their ability to
so I'm sure
put
that's
the cost of that onto the American economy and onto the American worker's paycheck, basically.
Right.
So if they wanted to create new money, they had to do it overseas. So that resulted in some, American economic imperialism, basically, which some people will rightfully complain about. But as far as the effect that it had on the American worker, it was pretty much minimal, because during that time period, the Fed had to keep the American economy somewhat stable, the price of the dollar fairly stable, and because of that, the American worker didn't feel the effects of any new money creation because any new money creation had to be hidden overseas. They couldn't do it here at home.
Interesting.
So you had our economy basically operated like a gold standard within the U.S. for about 25 years. Our effects around the globe were obviously very different from that, and there's some valid criticisms that people have of the Bretton Woods system because of that. But it was about the closest thing that we've had to a gold standard in over 100 years. And during that 25-year period, the average American worker saw their paycheck almost double.
Yeah.
That's not a small thing. I mean, having your quality of life go up to twice as well as it was at the end of World War II, that was huge.
Yeah.
And that had a huge impact on the way people lived their lives at that time. And the fact that pay has stagnated since then has also had a huge impact on the way people live their lives. So you look at like the 1970s when pay was starting to stagnate, that was the start of second wave feminism. That was the start of women, divorcing their husbands and wanting to get abortions because they didn't think that they could afford kids. That it resulted in a lot of changes in our lifestyles,
right.
And not just the feminism thing. You had a growing underclass that basically, as their paychecks stopped increasing, but their cost of living often continued to go up. There are a lot of things that you need today in order to make it in the world. Like you kind of have to have a cell phone for work, and you have to have a computer for school, things like that. So you have these additional costs that have continued to go up, and yet our pay isn't going up well enough to keep up with that. So now you have people living in smaller and smaller places. That's something that's affecting people's ability to start a family. If you can't afford a big enough place to fit 2 or 3 kids into, well, you're probably going to try not to have kids.
Yep.
So there are a lot of big lifestyle changes that happen because of that.
Yeah, that's definitely the bottom line. Absolutely.
Yeah.
One thing I was going to ask too is I didn't know if you had a certain kind of structure that you wanted to kind of stick to based on some preparation you had, or if you want me to just kind of ask questions like I'm almost like I'm a normie, because I am.
Oh, yeah.
Whichever way is better.
Yeah, any questions you've got, feel free to jump in with them, and I'll try to answer and explain as much as I can, or if you've got any comments, go ahead.
Sure. So, yeah, I guess, going back to the graphic in that key point around the 70s where that decouple happened. So you mentioned Bretton Woods. Are there any other key factors around that time that instigated that, or like was Bretton Woods like really the key to it, or like is there anything else about that period and that moment of decoupling that you wanted to talk about for next?
Yeah, so Bretton Woods was the big policy change. There was kind of a shift in economic power that happened around the same time that we'll get to a little bit later.
Right.
But yeah, as far as like policy changes, that was kind of the big one. And there were a few things that other people have tried to point to explain this that don't really explain it. So like people will suggest that falling union membership, the decline in union membership is a big factor. But union membership started to decline in like the mid 1950s. So you had almost 20 years worth of falling union membership, declining rates of union membership before worker pay started to fall.
Right.
You had 20 years there where union membership was going down and yet pay continued to go up. And so union membership didn't really have a big impact on it. Some people have pointed to immigration as a big factor, and I think it might be a small factor in there. But we actually saw the highest levels of immigration that in our country's history in the late up until maybe the last few years in the late 1990s, and worker pay was going up during that time period because the economy was booming due to the tech bubble, the dot-com bubble. So immigration, there's definitely good arguments, for and against immigration. Certainly the immigration policy we have now of basically just letting anyone in and not really enforcing our immigration laws, there's a lot to criticize about that.
Right.
But it's not actually that big of a factor when it comes to worker pay being suppressed. I mean, it has some impact, but it's not the main driving force in terms of what's actually keeping paychecks down.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. So those are some of the things that other people say that you don't think applies. So what else would you like? What would you say applies or contributes outside of Bretton Woods? Is there anything else, or is that?
I'd say it's primarily Bretton Woods as the cause. Pretty much every other potential cause that people have brought up that I've looked into doesn't really explain much of any of the impact in pay. And actually, let's go ahead and bring up that next article I sent you about the Federal Reserve and the impact that it has on the stock market. Uh, be the Yahoo News article.
Alrighty, let's see here. Window. Oh, I gotta have it open, I guess. So we got this one. Let's put it over here. And is it gonna recognize it? Oh, I should have already had it loaded. Window capture. Try again. There we go. Okay, that looks like the right one. Okay, so let's go ahead and say boom.
Yeah, the Fed caused 93% of the entire stock market's move since 2008. That's when you got pulled up.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, the Federal Reserve's actions directly causing more than 90% of the stock market's movement, and that was from 2008 up until about 2019. Once COVID hit, that probably had an impact. I think this article was written, 2016. So yeah, there was about a 10-year period there where the Federal Reserve's actions directly caused 90% of stock market movement. So pointing to Federal Reserve policy as being the primary driver of things that are happening in our economy, we're not just making that up.
Right.
That's like there's plenty of studies that show that the Federal Reserve has tons of power over our economy. So this is the entity that we really have to look at when it comes to what changed in our economy. And of course, Bretton Woods, that policy was something that that was a big impact on Federal Reserve policy. If you scroll down in that article, so you'll see, let me just read this off here. So from after World War II until the mid-1970s, future GDP outlook explained 90% of the stock market's move, according to the statistical analysis. So during the time period where Bretton Woods was in place and the Federal Reserve's hands were basically tied, their ability to affect the economy was very limited. GDP and basically just regular economic activity, that explained 90% of the stock market's movement, and you would kind of expect it to, because in a normal, healthy economy, whether or not your businesses are growing, whether business is good, whether it's bad, you would expect that to be the primary driver of the stock market.
Right.
But then you see GDP growth lost its sway on the market in the early 1970s with the rise of credit cards and consumer debt. Household liabilities grew with plastic first, followed by home mortgages until the real estate crash of the early 1990s. And the analysis showed that 95% of the entire market's move from the early 1970s until the early 1990s was explained by debt. It was explained by credit card and consumer debt and home mortgages. So those things are directly affected by Federal Reserve policy. The Federal Reserve sets the rates that banks can loan money at.
Yeah.
Their policies affect, fractional reserve banking and how much you can loan out versus how much you have to have on hand. So the Federal Reserve policies were directly affecting how much debt people could accrue and how much debt people could accrue. That was more than 90% of the effect of, the effect on the economy in that time period. So when you're looking at the graph and you're seeing that during that time period, worker pay stagnated and fell, Federal Reserve action was 90% of what was controlling the economy during the time when worker pay was falling. Then from the mid to late 1990s until 2000, you had the tech bubble, and of course that's where you saw so much economic growth in a sector that was really booming that it was actually able to kind of break through and overpower the debt cycle and cause that economic growth that you saw there in the late 1990s. And you did see worker pay go up quite a bit during the late 90s because the economy was just booming so much that even the debt cycle wasn't able to affect that. But once the tech bubble burst, yet again, you went back to mortgages being the biggest source of debt, the primary driver of the economy, and again, more than 90% of the market's movement was based on debt. Then 2008, you had the collapse of the housing market, and it was from 2008 to 2009, just after that big collapse in 2008, when a lot of wealthy people lost a lot of money, you saw the single biggest year for pay growth and worker pay in decades. That's not a coincidence. When you saw the rich people who were basically using the Federal Reserve and debt-based economy to make a lot of money, when they lost a lot of money, a lot of that money went back to the workers that they had been taking it from. So, when you line this analysis up with that graph of worker pay versus productivity, you can really see why pay, why it grew along with the economy normally up until the early 1970s, and then why it stopped growing up until the the mid 1990s. Why it grew again for a few years, stopped growing again for a few years, and then grew suddenly for a year and then stopped again. It pretty much all ties back to debt-based banking and to the Federal Reserve's actions.
Yep.
And
one thing, this reminds me, I don't know if I have talked to you about it or if you've seen it, but there's a good little, I think it's a 30-minute, animation. I think it's still on YouTube. It's like the collapse of the American dream, and it documents this so well. I'm going to try to link that after, along with all of these articles and your article, because that'll be really good. But yeah, that makes sense to me. It tracks. It goes over so many people's heads, though. It's just like it's so obvious, so in our faces, but yet so little, so little known. And that's of course because of some of these auxiliary connections. Because any institution that might report on this or shed light about this, is probably in bed with a lot of the same kind of forces, and anybody that speaks against it is going to get the full wrath of these forces. So we understand why this is continues into today.
Yeah, it is kind of a dangerous thing to talk about, and we'll get into that as we move on and get to the root of who's behind this. I am seeing somebody in the chat on Odyssey saying that women entered the workforce en masse around the mid-'70s, having labor costs from Jared Daniel Lee Martinez. That's kind of a correlation but not causation, where women entered the workforce not because they just woke up one day and said, hey, let's enter the workforce, but because men's pay started to stagnate in the early 1970s, because their paychecks weren't going up and even started to fall for a few years there in the early to mid 1970s, as men's pay started to fall, but women still wanted that same luxurious lifestyle, more of them had to enter the workforce. And especially when you had the stagflation that the Federal Reserve caused in the 1970s, when you had the oil crisis and rising prices, you had women entering the workforce because they felt like they needed to in order to maintain the same quality of life. So I don't think that women entering the workforce was the primary driving cause of labor costs going down. It might have been one contributing factor, but even then you got to look at, well, why did women enter the workforce? Well, women entered the workforce because of the economic conditions that were limiting their man's paycheck from going up at the same rate that it had been going up for 25 years. And so when you get into, well, why did men's pay stop going up? That's the root cause of why so many women entered the workforce. So any impact that women entering the workforce had on pay, I think, it might be a couple steps that you got to jump back to figure out the actual root cause of that. But I do believe that the root cause of that is Federal Reserve policy, and I don't think that it's, women entering the workforce was the root cause.
Yeah.
I think that was a reaction to a bigger cause.
Good point. Yeah.
Yep.
I see you had another comment in there too, that the stock market is directly correlated with the Fed, which we already kind of talked about a little bit, which I generally agree with. He's saying the rest of the economy, he would argue that the Fed doesn't matter, which I think in some of the evidence we've already presented kind of would probably contradict that a little bit. Just the fact that they control the rates of the loans, which housing market, so much trickles down from that, among other pieces. I would see that. And he says inflation and I guess deflation started in 1870. Well, I mean, I would think that we would have had inflation. We would technically have had inflation and deflation since the beginning of economy, since the beginning of currency. I mean, it's something that's happened behind the scenes since the beginning of whatever. But we've only maybe been tracking it or having economic terms to describe it for that. I could see that potentially. And then,
well, and we don't really have worker pay data solidly going back that far, so unfortunately we can't compare that against inflation all the way back.
Yeah.
But we can look at the period from 1945 till 1970 where we had basically a very low limit on inflation that could be imposed on the American worker, and we can look at that and say, well, when we basically did not inflate the dollar, worker pay went up consistently. When we were then allowed to inflate the dollar again, worker pay did not go up consistently. So we can show a much stronger correlation there than we can show for any other factor affecting worker pay. Where he says that population and labor competition are what causes decline in standard of living. In a normal, healthy economy, yes, you're going to see that. But in an economy where it's basically being rigged by a central bank, that central bank is going to be able to affect things on a kind of a higher level And so a lot of the normal factors that you would see affecting the prices of goods, of labor, the availability of things, a lot of those end up being overshadowed by what the central bank is doing.
Yep.
So I think under a normal economy you would be right, but under an economy where the central bank has as much power as it's had since the early 1970s,
and that's the funny thing.
Correct under that situation.
That's the funny thing about that level of power is that like we've been alluding to, it trickles over to other areas such as like encouraging immigration, which does that, which increases population and drives down labor. Or drives up labor competition and therefore down labor wages. So, yeah, a lot of connections. Good points.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Very good.
All right, so that's pretty good on that source, and I think this is about the limit of anything that we could show on YouTube if you're still streaming to YouTube.
Nope, but I'll try to upload it, but we'll see. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because the next thing we've got to get into is, well, if the Federal Reserve is the primary thing that drove worker pay down over the last 50 years, well, who runs the Federal Reserve and where did all of the money go? And that's where we start to get into the questions of power politics and who's actually running things.
Yep.
So if you bring up Janet Yellen's Wikipedia page, we'll just start with her.
We'll just start with the early life here. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're going to here. So, when you look at Janet Yellen's career, she didn't really spend a whole lot of time in the corporate world. She spent quite a bit of time in the academic world, but didn't, she's not some like big corporate banker, big wig. She's not somebody that worked for Chase or, U.S. Bank or, any of the other like really big banks. She did anything like that. She was just an academic economist, and so the one thing that she has in common with basically all of the Federal Reserve, almost all the Federal Reserve chairs since 1970, since just before this problem started, is that she is of Jewish descent, and it says right there, first line of her early life, that she was born to a family of Polish Jewish ancestry. If you go back to her predecessor Ben Bernanke, again you've got a guy who mostly had an academic career, didn't spend a whole lot of time working for big business, but he was the Bernankes were one of the few Jewish families in Dillon and attended Ohav Shalom, a local synagogue. So. And Bernanke, again, I mean, Jews are 2% of the population, and here there were 2 Federal Reserve chairs in a row. You go back to his predecessor, Alan Greenspan.
Oh, you already know.
Yeah, Greenspan was born in the Washington Heights area of New York City. His father, Herbert Greenspan, was of Romanian Jewish descent, and his mother, Rose Goldsmith, was of Hungarian Jewish descent. He did spend some time, I think, in the banking industry. He spent a lot more time in Ayn Rand's objectivist movement, and Ayn Rand, of course, was a Jewish philosopher. So not only was he a Jew, but he was a Jew who spent a lot of time working with other Jews. You look at his predecessor, Paul Volcker. F is not going to say anything about him being Jewish. He was ethnically Jewish, and let's see, I think I sent you a source from Ynet News. Where Ynet News is an Israeli news outlet, and so Ynet News says that he was born. Let's see, let me find the.
Well, the funny thing is, you eventually get so good at it, you can just see it in their facial features.
Oh yeah, so yeah, born to a Jewish family in New Jersey, Volcker attended Princeton University, and Harvard and the London School of Economics. So. Paul Volcker, according to Jewish sources, is Jewish. According to non-Jewish sources, he's not Jewish because he's hereditarily Jewish, but not religiously Jewish.
Oh, this is funny, too. I just noticed about Volcker. I see he says he played an important role in Nixon's decision to suspend the gold convertibility on the dollar in 1971, which resulted in the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. Yeah, it's like, oh, yeah, of course.
Yep, so he was a big part of the change, and of course it was during his time as Federal Reserve Chair that we saw the biggest drop in worker pay. So the guy who was responsible for taking us off of Bretton Woods and eliminating the last tie to the gold standard that we had, he's oversaw the biggest drop in worker pay in the last 75 years.
Yeah.
So, kind of crazy.
It's just like
you look at his.
It just made me think, like, it's funny. Like, we do like a whole show that's just like the early live show, and we just like go through a list and just go through Wikipedia.
Oh, you'd be amazed at some of the things you could find in there.
Yeah.
But his predecessor, G. William Miller, he was not Jewish, but he was only in from 1978 to 1979 under Jimmy Carter. So, Carter made the mistake of putting a non-Jewish Federal Reserve chair in, had to correct that mistake, and still got booted out of office for it. When you look on the graph, though, like if you bring back up the worker pay versus productivity graph, you will see on there in the late 1970s, so during that couple of years or so that he was in there, you actually did have a little bit of worker pay growth during that time period, whereas most of the rest of the 70s it was stagnant or dropping.
Yep.
So it is interesting that the one non-Jewish Federal Reserve chair
you can see it on the graph. That's hilarious.
Yeah.
And depressing at the same time.
Yep. And then you go back to his predecessor, Arthur Burns, who got in 1970. So, he got in 1970. In 1971, his friend Paul Volcker helped get rid of Bretton Woods, and from there, everything went downhill. Well, you look at his early life, and he was born in a province of the Austro-Hungarian Empire to Polish-Jewish parents.
Yep.
So, from 1970 up until, I think it was 2018 or 19 that Jerome Powell took over. For that, basically that 50-year period from 1970 to 2020, we'll call it, you had Jewish Federal Reserve chairs for like 47 out of that 50 years.
Yeah. And plus,
so 2% of the population.
We know at this level of like maturity in this system and nepotism that too, obviously the people who get selected who are non-Jewish were still very much willing to, go in line with the same direction too. So.
Yeah, and we're seeing that with Jerome Powell, where I was a little hopeful when he first got in, because there were a couple years there under Trump where worker pay growth was pretty good, and then COVID hit, and that pretty much tanked it all.
Yeah.
So I was a little bit hopeful when Powell got put in that maybe things were going to turn around. Maybe it was actually a bit of a change of power, but the more we've seen of it, the more he's not really doing anything to fix the problem. And I don't know if it's just that the swamp is too deep at this point and there's no draining it, or a lot of people think that Trump is kind of controlled opposition, and I'm leaning towards that position the more I see of things.
Right.
So, yeah, and I mean, there's room to disagree over that, but definitely, they've gotten so much control over the system at this point that there's almost nothing that you could do, even if you did get the right person into the top spot, because everyone below them would be working against them.
Right. Okay, so we're about halfway in, assuming we're going to go about an hour, about 30 minutes. So I'm trying to think, because a lot of the other, we could definitely take a deeper dive into the Federal Reserve as far as like how it came to be, how else they control influence, like through inflation and taxation on the inflation, and the fact that the IRS was signed in at the same time as the Federal Reserve. And welcome, Tyrant, to the chat. So we could talk more about that, but I keep coming back to that video. That 30-minute video is so succinct. I feel like for the common knowledge for most people, it does a great job. But so it's up to you if you want to keep going deeper into the Federal Reserve and some of those mechanisms. But since we've already set ourselves up, what we also could do instead is something that video doesn't really go into. That they go hard on the Rothschilds, but they don't really talk about the JQ at all. So which direction would you prefer to go? We could kind of talk more about the Jewish question, or we could stay on the Federal Reserve a little bit longer.
Well, I've got a couple other things to go into, and then if you want to go into something on the Rothschilds after that, we can get into that in a little bit.
Sure.
So the one other point that I want to make on the Federal Reserve chairs is if you look at the people who came before Arthur Burns, so William Martin, Thomas McCabe, and Mariner Eccles, none of them were Jewish. So during that 25-year-long period where we had solid worker pay growth, where worker pay almost doubled in the space of about 25 years, we had non-Jewish Federal Reserve chairs. From 1970 till 2018, when we had almost no worker pay growth, we had almost nothing but Jewish Federal Reserve chairs. So you can really see the difference. Like, if you were to just kind of draw a line down that graph, I think the graph that you showed had the line in 1973.
Yeah.
But if you put it in 1970, it would look about the same. Where you can see before we got a Jewish Federal Reserve chair, constant pay growth. Since we got a Jewish Federal Reserve chair, basically no pay growth. So it's pretty amazing that you can see that. But that by itself isn't quite enough to prove that Jews are ripping off a huge chunk of your pay. So let's go to that next source that I sent you. I think it's a Jewish Telegraph Agency article about the portion of the Forbes 400 who are Jewish.
Yes. Got it. I got it pulled up.
Okay. Yeah, so looking at that, 139 out of the top 400 wealthiest people in the United States of America were Jewish as of about 10 years ago when that article was written. So
Yep.
that's a little over a third of the American billionaire class are Jewish. And if you look at like the top spots, it's like half of the top 10. Five
Right.
out of the top 10 are Jewish. So at the top end, you're even more overrepresented with Jews.
Yeah.
So if you figure that, more than a third of the wealthiest people in America are Jewish and they're 2% of the population,
Hmm.
well, if you're wondering where roughly a third of every worker's pay has gone, why is the billionaire class overrepresented? Why are Jews overrepresented in the billionaire class by about the same percentage as the percentage of your pay that's getting stolen from you?
There's two.
And it's
Sorry, go
oh,
ahead.
go ahead.
I just had two quick points I wanted to interject. One thing about, especially when you look at these like wealthy lists and people you think of as being wealthy, another huge thing to consider is that Jews, because of the way they operate with familial, like sticking to their family, sticking to their culture, and generational wealth, it's rare that like one person, one name gets a lot of wealth. It's usually sometimes distributed across the family or even just totally hidden behind the scenes. Like they, of course, don't like to be in the spotlight. They want to try, you're truly, if I were ruling the world in a parasitic type way, I would not want to be in the spotlight, right? So that's another thing to consider.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing I wanted to bring up is just going back to the Federal Reserve is a huge part about it is it is a private institution. It's, that's just a huge part of the trick. It's called the Federal Reserve to make people think it's like official, but it's a private institution. And if it's a private institution, that means it has investors. And it's like, well, who are those investors? And that's where you start to, you follow the money, you see like, that's where you start to, it unfolds from there. I just wanted to mention that. Yeah.
Well, that's sort of semi-private, semi-governmental, where it's like it's created by the government, it's partially run by the government, and when you look at like the investors in the Federal Reserve, they do have shares and they do get dividends based on those shares, but a portion of the Federal Reserve's profits, so to speak, ends up going back to the government, whereas a portion of it goes to those private investors who own shares in it. So that is one way that people make money off the Federal Reserve.
Mm-hmm.
Another way is just by manipulating the way that debt-based economics work. They've actually got a system set up where a bank can loan money to another bank, and then that bank can count that towards their balance sheet, which allows them to loan
Yes.
out multiple times that amount of money and make interest on that.
Oh my
So
God.
you can have banks loaning money back and forth to each other in order to increase the amount of money that they can loan out that they can then make
It's
interest
absurd.
off.
It's so and that again. Once
Yeah.
I'm going to plug it for the third time. That I'm going to link that video probably 3 times. The collapse of the American dream. You can also go search it up. It communicates that perfectly. And And you talk about just it goes into the larger history of fractional reserve banking and how that alone is crooked. You're only keeping like 5-10% of the actual reserve on hand, and the rest of it's just like banknotes and just like it's so easy that it could collapse. And then of course just like the interest rates on top of that, and so much room for immoral practices. Yep, absolutely.
Yep. So I guess we've pretty much seen that your pay is getting stolen. We've seen that the Federal Reserve is responsible for an oversized amount of power over our economy, and that they had that power mainly during the time when your pay was being stolen. We've seen who runs the Federal Reserve, and we've seen that their people have a massively disproportionate amount of money during the time period when they were in charge of the institution that was able to steal the large amount of money that's missing from you. But there's one more piece of this puzzle that I didn't actually put in the Oons article when I first wrote it, but a lot of it's kind of come out since then, where we've been able to put all these pieces together, and that is how this criminal cartel is able to maintain its hold over our government. And so for that one, I'd like you to bring up that source about who Jeffrey Epstein worked for, because as you can see, there's plenty of witnesses who say that Jeffrey Epstein worked for the Israeli intelligence agency, Mossad. And it's not just that there's multiple witnesses saying that. I mean, it's this particular guy was somebody who worked with Jeffrey Epstein. So he was a direct witness to quite a few of the Israeli intelligence operations that Jeffrey Epstein was a part of. There's also the fact that Ghislaine Maxwell's father, Robert Maxwell, who, I mean, we could honestly do an entire show about him. He was kind of a crazy historical figure. He got up to a lot of stuff, but he had a state funeral in Israel attended by the entire leadership of Israeli intelligence. And then his daughter went on to help run a child sex trafficking ring that sexually blackmailed rich, famous, and powerful people. It wasn't just Epstein and Maxwell. You had Claire Bronfman, the head of the NXIVM sexual blackmail ring, which targeted journalists, celebrities, and media company executives. Her father, Edgar Bronfman, was business partners with Robert Maxwell on multiple ventures, also had direct ties to a group called the Mega Group, which is an Israeli lobbying firm that Robert Maxwell was also a part of. Also had direct ties to the Israeli government. You have other figures like Roy Cohn, Trump's mentor, who is widely rumored to be doing the same thing and to have been involved with Jewish mobster Meyer Lansky. You had Anthony Weiner, who was married to Hillary Clinton's chief of staff, who got convicted of, basically trying to groom underage girls for sex trafficking. You have figures like Assi Ben Mosh, who's the guy from the Sound of Freedom movie. He ran the sex trafficking ring, the child prostitution resorts that were featured in that, and he was a former Israeli military intelligence operative. So you basically have this entire criminal cartel worth of child sex traffickers who set up sexual blackmail rings. Assi Ben Mosh targeted mainly business leaders. Claire Bronfman targeted mainly media people and celebrities, and Epstein and Maxwell mainly targeted political people, but a lot of them, there was some overlap there. They were willing to go after anybody that was rich, famous, and powerful enough that they could get their hooks into. And I'm going to be honest with you, the things that have actually been exposed publicly, they're just the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole lot more going on there. I mean, you don't control a multi-trillion-dollar theft of basically a huge chunk of a nation's economy without there being a whole lot of pieces in place there.
Yeah.
And so what we saw when we saw, a few members of that corrupt elite going down, that was the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of blackmail going on there. There's a lot of corruption going on.
Yep.
But people who are willing to rape kids to sexually blackmail people, of course they're going to be willing to steal trillions of dollars out of your economy. I mean, that's how they get away with it. That's how they maintain their power over the system.
Right. And of course that's just two pieces. Like, okay, so we're seeing Jewish representation in banking and finance and this kind of stuff. We're seeing Jewish representation in sex trafficking and blackmailing therein. And then, it just goes from there. You go into some of these other fields, like just media, like look at all the big MSNBC, CNN, look at all of these, look at I've got some good graphics. I just wrote an article about it that I'll probably link as well, that goes into that.
Feel free to pull up your sources on that real quick if you want to.
Yeah, we could take a look. Kind of funny because half my sources are memes, but at the same time, if you just go through Wikipedia or whatever you consider to be valid sources, it's going to lead to the same place. Let's see here. Yeah, I'll pull it up real quick. Do I have it on here? And one thing I wanted to say too, as we're going into this, it's kind of funny, an idea I just had, which is that when it comes to the Jewish question, which we've already kind of transitioned to, when you're on the front end of that, it's funny, people have these certain hangups, which are a lot of these cultural programming, oh, you're talking about Jews, that's bad. Oh, you're talking about Jews, Nazis, blah, 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 whatever, that kind of stuff. So you have that on the front end, and once you make it through that, the next part is kind of easy. Once you're just open to it and you start just assessing the truth of the situation and comparing patterns, it's oh yeah, easy. And that's kind of what we're talking about now, is to help facilitate that. And then there's okay, once you're informed, then it's well, what next? What do we do? And that's the next discussion. So maybe before the end of this or next time, we will kind of maybe try to break down that. We'll call it a 3-step process. But anyway, let's go ahead and pull up this. We'll pull up some of what I was working on my website here. I think I've got it here. I use a lot of memes. We'll take a quick stroll through this. I called it, we were just talking, I called it Jews as just as kind of like a shocker. It's okay, what is this? You've probably seen this meme before, the 5 stages of noticing, oh, that's all fake, you're lying. Oh, you're just, you pretty much, you're just a horrible person, you're a bad person for even bringing that up. Just because they have those positions doesn't mean they, that doesn't mean anything. It's okay, they are overrepresented, but they work hard and they're smart. That's just who they are. It's like, you know, again, they just yeah, the same thing. It's just like they work to do it, and then you start to say, oh, you know, it starts to unfold, and that's kind of where we're at. You know, every single time I go to Wikipedia. So yeah, I won't even go through the text. Just some of the memes like tell the story honestly. You've got people like, you know, scapegoating so many different, like, it's you know, it's Illuminati, it's socialist, it's the whatever, you know, and then and this gets into a larger picture too about the victimization narrative and the overt tactics, which we might be able to get into. We only have about, I'd say we probably have about 15-20 minutes, so that might be for next time. Again, you look at the connections like, oh, hedge fund billionaires, the press, Hollywood, porn, Biden's cabinet, billionaire donor class, vulture capitalists, foreign war hawks, a Federal Reserve chairman, and it's like ding, 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 ding. You know,
Yeah.
overrepresented across big tech, across media, across Ivy League, across advertising, across Defense Department, across the Federal Reserve Board governors. You know, it's just like, God, you know, like I said, once you get to this stage, once you get over those holdups that most people have about like, oh, you can't talk about the Jews, or you can't like be pointing this out. Like once you get over that, then it's just like boom. And here's the big one I was talking about. It just shows like a whole bunch of the chairmans and so forth. What's up, D2T?
Yeah, and it's interesting that we've got like the white privilege narrative going on when, you know, you look at that graph and you see that the white working class has not had a real raise in 50 years, just like, you know, the black and brown working class hasn't gotten one either.
Right.
You know, almost nobody's gotten a real raise except for that handful of people at the top. And when you look at the handful of people at the top, white people are actually underrepresented among them. It's,
yeah,
you know, it's a very
and that's
largely
just
a Jewish cartel.
Yeah, and that's another huge part of it. Just like all the attacks on the whites and the tricks that they use, you know, where like they identify as white when it's convenient to them, and then they don't when it's not. And we'll get there too. Like I said, it's probably warrants its own discussion to frame this a little better. But this is a good segue. And this is what happens when you talk to other guys and they're like, oh yeah, you know about the Jewish connections. Like, how did it start for you? You know, well, I just started looking into this, and it all roads lead to Rome. You know, it's just like it all comes back. And like we were talking about earlier, we talked about immigration. And, you know, it was mentioned in chat about how population growth erodes. Or increases supply, which lowers wages. And here's like
labor competition. Yeah.
Yes, and here's a whole collection that I found of Jews who are involved in pushing pro-immigration narratives. It is just mind-boggling. It's documented so well. And then
I think part of the reason for that is they feel like they have to keep us, divided against each other. Well, if they can't divide us against each other enough, then they need to bring in outside groups to divide us against, so that way we're busy fighting each other instead of busy fighting the people at the top.
Yeah, and of course that's a whole other hypocrisy too. Like you look at the state of Israel, and they have all the reverse policies. Like they're literally shooting people at their own border, and they're deporting Africans. And then meanwhile, all the other countries, they say, yeah, let them in. Yeah, it's just another part of the hypocrisy, and it all starts to come together. And of course, you get into you go farther back into history. Well, what about communism? What about Bolshevism? Like. And this is the thread, just, it goes so deep. Like I said, we only have probably going to give another 10, 15 minutes today, but this is just, this just goes on and on. And we talked about a little bit about Yellen, who is on Biden's cabinet. You see her here, among some others in Biden's cabinet. And then we also even see Trump's cabinet is not free of this. Trump is not, he's definitely not free of it. So it's just
there's a quote, I forget who it's by and exactly how it was worded, but it was something like, when we need heroes, the elite will provide them for us.
Yeah. And
so when you look at somebody like Donald Trump, you do see somebody where he said a lot of the right things, and he even did a few things that looked like they were, going to move us in the right direction. But ultimately, he was controlled by the same people, and he was there to be kind of a pressure release valve rather than to actually save the day and fix any of our problems.
Yeah, and it gets into this whole thing about and again, this warrants probably its own video as well, where once you have got an understanding of the general problem, then it's just like a whole conversation about the solutions and the obstacles to that. And that's a big part of it too. You've got people that are almost like either controlled opposition, or they kind of are moving in the right direction, but they're just not willing to go that far. And a lot of it comes down to moving to Overton and stuff like that, and we'll get into it. But I guess I'll try to... Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and there's some room for debate about, like, is this basically just a Jewish mafia, which I think is pretty accurate. So some people might look at that part of the discussion and say, well, whoa, whoa, I'm afraid of anti-Semitism hurting innocent people. Well, if you want to avoid it hurting the, the innocent random Jew on the street, you kind of have to deal with the Jewish elite. You have to find a way to talk about them and say, look, this Jewish cartel, they're the problem. That's who we have to deal with. Because if we can't do that, like, the backlash is going to keep building, and it's going to keep building.
It's going to get worse. We're trying to make it better.
The problem is still there. So if that's what you're concerned with, you need to be as outspoken as possible against the people who are actually the problem and direct people towards solving that problem.
Productive
because if we're not solving that problem,
nature's going to solve that problem. And nature solves problems with blood, and we don't want it to get there.
It's one of two things that's going to happen. Either things are going to escalate and accelerate to the point where it's going to be a much bigger and more destructive backlash, or we're never actually going to be free, and we're all going to continue to get a third of our paychecks stolen from us by a criminal cartel that rapes kids to control our government.
And that's only a part of it too. Just the paycheck.
I don't like either of those. So I really do think that we need to start focusing on some of these corrupt people, which Larry Fink had his picture pulled up. That's a very key player.
Yeah, we were about to say, like, BlackRock, I mean, they're the ones buying up all the real estate. I mean, they're doing so many, and they're the ones who pull a lot of these strings whenever you look at, like, the ADL and how they influence these companies. Like, BlackRock has, like, shares in so many different companies. So, that's a huge part of it. I wanted to kind of finish some of these. We talked about Hollywood. There's some good sources in here about that. And then all these other international organizations like the International Monetary Fund, a lot of these, like, international central banks. You've got these individual actors like Kissinger and Soros who play a part. But yeah, the Jewish thread is definitely a big part of it. We talked about the trafficking. We talked about the Rothschilds. And what we may do with the rest of our...
We could touch more on, like, the Rothschilds and some of the other old banking families like the Warburgs. There are quite a few of those big old banking families that have been up to this kind of thing for a very long time. So they didn't just show up one day and take over. This is something that's been kind of building up for a very long time.
Yes.
This is.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean,
have had a lot of time to practice their tactics.
Yeah, exactly. Like, and that's what I love about the class of the American Dream is it goes back to, like, the beginning of banking in general, as well as the beginning of the Rothschild banking dynasty, and then the history of the Semitic peoples and how they developed their evolutionary strategy to be subversive and so forth goes back even farther to the Roman Empire, and it gets, like, religious. I mean, it's just a huge thing. It'll continue to be a very key thread, and so. But like I said, the frames are always so important because the biggest, like, again, once you get people over that hump, it's just like boom, all the evidence is there. So it's really what are those mental blocks that keep us from having, what are those obstacles getting this conversation out there, to moving the Overton, to getting more normies kind of involved in. And that's a situation to situation kind of thing. You have to look at where each person's at. Even with people like with my wife and stuff, I had to just small pieces at a time. Like, you can't just throw everything at somebody because it's a lot to take in. And many people, even if they know the truth, it's hard. It's so hard because you're risking your life, you're risking your livelihood, you're risking your relationships, you're risking so many things to even talk about this. But yet, if it's so central. It must be talked about.
Yeah.
So.
It's also such a big part of what's impacting your life right now, though, because if literally a third of your paycheck is being stolen, I mean, look at how much has been stolen from you over the course of your life. Think about how much more is going to be stolen from you over the remainder of your life.
Right.
Think about how much better off your life would be if we could take these people down and you could get that back.
Yeah. And that's just the beginning. That's just one tiny piece of it, but that's a very tangible piece to so many people. It's like, hey, money's being stolen from you. Like, that's something very real in front of people's faces. And then for other people, like, if they have relationship problems and they're having, like, different mental illnesses and stuff, well, let's look at that. Like, where does that come from? Oh, it was something about school that you either did or didn't learn in school, or something in the workplace, or the woke movements. Like, there's just so many. Again, all roads end up leading to Rome usually. Yeah, it is a core piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, and they're not just stealing it from you, they're stealing it from your friends, they're stealing it from your families, they're stealing from basically everybody that you've ever met, unless you know somebody who's
Yeah.
a millionaire or richer, you know?
Yeah, it's like,
Like,
and it's like mind-boggling too, because it's not, it's one thing to they just take the taxes, but then they like cause the inflation, and then they tax the inflation, and then it's like, oh my god,
yeah.
it's wild. I mean, it's honestly at some level you kind of have to take a step back and just appreciate how genius and how brilliant and how well executed and organized it all is, even though it's evil. It's totally evil, but it's like, wow, they did a good job, and so you kind of have to applaud them for that. But at the same time, they're not playing by the rules. Like they are is the most like despicable tactics imaginable.
They are the most dangerous parasite in all of history, and as somebody who's got a fascination with biology, I do have to have some amount of respect for that.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah, exactly.
it's fascinating. It's also horrifying, but it's fascinating.
See, this is one thing I like about where like the institute, their framing is very much in that they stick to that more because they're all about operationality and first causes and so forth. It very much is in that like anthropological, biological, evolutionary group strategy, and it is a parasitic group strategy. And like, okay, there's all kinds of parasites in nature. There's ticks and leeches and all kinds of stuff, and that is natural. Technically, that is natural, but it's also natural for the bear or whatever organism is being parasited on to try to get those off of it. And we are Europe is being parasited, or Western civilization is being parasited. So we are having a very natural reaction to that, and part of that too. An analogy I've used a lot of times is like, nature is competition, and I like to use the analogy of like sports, because sports are like a game, it's a competition, but there are still like some kind of a layer of agreed upon rules that you operate by. Like in order to have like economy and a lot of these things that we love in society, we have to have some kind of like agreement not to just murder each other outright. You have laws. There's a lot of layers you build on top of, and if someone's breaking rules at this fundamental moral layer and subverting and all this kind of stuff, then it kind of just crumbles the whole thing. And that's what's happening. The fabric, the foundation of our society is being eroded. It has been eroded. Honestly, it's like on its last thread, and about to fall down. So yeah. Yep. Got a lot of work to do, but this is where it starts.
Yep. Well, hopefully this has been eye-opening for people, and hopefully it's a good motivation to get involved and spread the word about what's going on right now, because this, it's really taking a lot out of your life, and it's degrading society in a way that's making life worse for everybody that you've ever known or cared about, basically.
Yep.
So.
Yep. It's funny. Sorry, go ahead.
Not to oversell this or anything, but I mean, it is the issue of our time.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The history books, for better or worse, win or loss. I mean, even if we lose, like, this will continue to be the struggle. Like, ultimately, if we prevail and survive as a human species, this will be documented. You're right. It is absolutely critical. Oh yeah, I was gonna say, we started out kind of just like talking about the Federal Reserve, and it's almost like we Trojan horse a little bit. It's like, boom, like look at this huge thing. It's like it's such a big topic that it almost warrants like its own like preface. But we will have plenty of time to circle back around to it and explore the layers and break it down. And I think the important thing too is just to do so in this format to demonstrate that we're sane people just like anyone else. Like yes, we might have different tendencies and so forth that allows us to be a little bit more willing to be edgy and explore the truth and get into these controversial areas, but that's why we're the leaders of it. That's why we're some of the people that are taking more of a risk and getting that word out there. But yeah, ultimately that's how it disseminates, is by regular everyday conversations. This is an issue that affects us all, and yeah, well,
and we made it like half an hour in before we actually transitioned over to the Jewish subject.
We got to pat ourselves on the back for that. We made it 30 minutes without, because like I said, all roads lead to Rome. I mean, it's just going to be a big thing. And when we're discussing the problem, like the overall problem, the complex web of interconnected forces and stuff, of course there's going to be other pictures. It's not that simple. It's not just like, the Jews. But, it will oftentimes lead to that. But there's so many balances to be found, just in terms of the optics and the way we talk about it and all this kind of stuff. But in addition to that whole conversation about the problem, in the natural order, a big part of it, I want to focus on the solution as much. Like, how can we do better about it? What can we do? How can we take a strategic and civil steps forward rather than just constantly being like, look at what they're doing, look at what they're doing, look at what they're doing, getting everybody mad like Alex Jones does. But it's like, what can we even do about it? You're just getting me mad, but you're not offering me solutions. So what does that do, right? So that'll be another thing we'll keep in mind too. So.
Yeah, and the best solution that I can really offer to people that's realistic at a small scale with what we can do with the movement that we've got now is start building the parallel economy. Start, moving as much as you can out of the formal economy, and that means grow your own food, barter with friends and neighbors, exchange goods and services for goods and services rather than using the broken Federal Reserve notes. And that's it's not a super easy process to get started, but it is something that there are communities out there that are working on it. There are homesteading communities, there are, local exchanges. Anything that you can do to kind of break out of that formal economy just a little bit, it's a step in the right direction, because we're going to have to build something that's separate and outside of the economy that's being controlled by our enemies.
Yes.
Yes. We have to kind of start building up our power base somewhere and somehow.
Yes, I love that. It's I was going to say, so not only is it just like the Federal Reserve itself and some of the banking practices, but it's like it's built into the currency itself. Like the fiat itself is busted, and so is every single institution that surrounds or relates to it anyway. And so what we are tasked with is pretty much if we, it's like you start out just wanting to, it's so funny. You start out wanting to solve like one little problem, but because of how deeply interwoven it all is, it really ends up being like a quest, a task to reimagine the whole thing, and that's daunting to some, exciting to me. It's like, wow, we can just rebuild the whole thing. And a big part of that, I was actually having a conversation earlier today, talking about alternative currency and how that can be tied into family. So there's a really good discussion brewing over there, which I think is going to be super powerful. So I'm excited about that one. And of course, just all the different organizations and parallel, everyone's picking up on this. Everyone is picking up on the need for this like parallel. And I see so many organizations. It's just like such an uplifting movement. And this is a big thing, another balance and a big problem that I see a lot among like the truth seekers, sensible center, dissonant right, whatever you want to say, is the black pilling. It's just like, oh my God, like so many problems. And it's just so depressing and overwhelming. But the goal is to balance that with the optimism and step up to the plate and believe and to act like we can do something about it, because we can. So that's just another white pills, optimism, engineering, creativity, problem solving. Like that's what the natural order is about. That's what I'm about. So I'm excited.
Yeah, and I definitely understand the black pill. I've been there, but you
need both.
If you let that get you down, you're not going to do anything to fix the problem.
Yeah, exactly.
At some point, you got to find something that you love, that you care about, that gives you the motivation to try and build something to resist that.
Yeah, absolutely. It is balance. Like you've got to expose yourself to the truth, even if it's depressing. But balance that. Absolutely, with building and again, just back to that idea of creativity and construction. There is so much of not only is there a black pilling culture, but there's also like a culture of critique that is constantly, like I said, just like problem. But and deconstructing, saying, even other people that are solving problems, they're like trying to be like, oh, y'all are doing it bad, blah, blah, blah. But they're never trying to do something themselves. And so at some point you gotta put yourself out there. And that's what we're doing. I love it. So, hell yeah.
All right. Well, I think this has been a good episode. We got through everything I was hoping to get through. So unless you got anything to add.
No, that's probably a good place to leave it off for now. We probably got some other topics to maybe try to explore next week. Thank you, everybody, for jumping on and commenting. Love to have the interaction, and love to see y'all continue to engage. And, so otherwise, we'll probably close it out there and see y'all in a week. Thank you.
All right. Later.